So we're all very familiar with the original Crash Bandicoot, right? It's been around for almost 25 years now, so if you haven't seen it at least once, well, I don't know what to tell you. Even people living under a rock would have at least heard of it. Anyway, we all know what it's like, how it plays, how it looks, how it sounds, it's all very familiar. But the Crash one we know isn't what it could have been. In 2018, Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, the original creators of Crash Bandicoot, published the Crash Bandicoot Files, which is a collection of most of, if not all, the development documents and artwork that Naughty Dog used during the development of Crash 1. This book is full of all kinds of interesting things that give a pretty good idea of how Crash 1 changed during its development, and gives a bit of insight into what was added or removed from the final game. I absolutely love this type of stuff. I find it unendingly fascinating, so I'm very excited about this video. Just in case there are any legal issues or copyright issues, I won't be showing actual pages from the book, but everything I talk about in this video is coming from that book. Before we dive in though, let's just get through a bit of admin. It turns out only 4% of viewers on my channel are actually subscribed, which means there is a 96% chance that you, the lovely person watching this, are not one of those viewers. If you like what you see here, definitely click that subscribe button. I guarantee you it'll be worth it. Also, leave a like while you're down there. Anyway, I'm sure you're amped up and ready to dive into this video, so let's not waste any more time. The first thing of interest is a set of two level lists. They're both near identical, with only one single level being different between them. These level lists actually show that the levels were divided up and split into themes at this point in development. So you'd have a world of jungle levels, a world of village levels, a world of ruin levels, you get the idea. This isn't how it turned out in the final game, as in the final game the levels aren't split into themes, they're sprinkled and scattered amongst each other. In this level list the game is split into 8 worlds. The first world features 2 jungle levels, 4 village levels and a boss fight. The levels are given subcategories, so the 2 jungle levels are called Entrance and Rollers 1. I'm going to take a stab in the dark and assume that these levels later became Insanity Beach and Jungle Rollers. The 4 village levels are called 2D1, Inside 2 and 2D2. 2D1 and 2D2 are most likely the Great Gate and Native Fortress, and the only thing I think the inside levels could possibly be are the hog riding levels, since they do take place within the village. The boss is of course Papu Papu. The second world consisted of 3 jungle levels, a mountain level and a boss. The jungle levels are River 1, Rollers 2 and Boulder Chase 1, which would most likely become Upstream, Rolling Stones and Boulders in the final game. The mountain level was called 2D Dirt Cliff, and interestingly it has been crossed out, which makes sense as in the final game there are no levels where Crash scales up a mountain wall. However, if I'm not mistaken, there is an unfinished mountain level in the data of the Crash 1 prototype somewhere, so maybe that's what this level was meant to be. The second boss in the final game is Ripperoo, but in this list, the second boss is actually Koala Kong, which is interesting. The third world contains 3 jungle levels, a mountain level and a boss. The jungle levels are Boulder Chase 2, which would become Boulder Dash, River 2, which would become Up the Creek, and Rollers 3, which would be another level like Jungle Rollers or Rolling Stones. Rollers 3 is actually the level that's different in the second list. In the older list, Rollers 3 is instead another mountain level called 2D Donkey Kong, which probably would have taken inspiration from the classic Donkey Kong games. Neither Rollers 3 nor 2D Donkey Kong made it into the final game though, but I'm pretty sure that there is a bare skeleton of a Donkey Kong style level in the prototype version, so that's most likely what this level was going to be. The mountain level is called Waterfall, and I know for a fact that there is an unfinished version of this level in the prototype, and that's probably what this mountain waterfall level was supposed to be. As you'd expect from being preceded by scaling a waterfall, the boss here is Ripperoo, which takes place on top of that waterfall. It's actually really cool seeing how these levels and bosses were originally going to fit together, and seeing the remnants of that in the final version. The fourth world is very interesting. It contains 4 ruins levels called Platform 1, 2D1, 2D2 and Platform 2, which I'm assuming to be Temple Ruins, Lost City, Sunset Vista and Jaws of Darkness in that order. But the interesting part here is the boss. The boss of this world is one that did not make it into the final game at all, and it's the fight against Kimono and Komodo. These two didn't make it into the final game, but it's pretty obvious that these 2 unknown characters would later become Komodo Mo and Komodo Joe and appear in Crash 2. It's a shame that we didn't get to see what their fight could have looked like in Crash 1, but I think it's still pretty cool that the Komodo Bros were planned to be in the series right from the very beginning. The fifth world is almost exactly the same as this section of the game in the final version. It features 4 power plant levels and a boss. These levels are 3D, 2D platforms and barrel roll, which are most likely Cortex power, heavy machinery, generator room and toxic waste. The order of the levels are slightly different in the final version, but the section of the game is fundamentally the same. The boss of this area is also, of course, Pinstripe. The sixth world features 2 mountain levels, 2 castle levels and a boss. The mountain levels are called Rope Bridge 1 and Rope Bridge 2, so it's pretty obvious that these levels would later become Road to Nowhere and the High Road. The castle levels are called Halls 1 and Halls 2, which I think are most likely lights out and fumbling in the dark. The boss of this area is Embryo. It seems that they had the end of the game pretty thoroughly settled on, since a lot of it is quite similar to how the final version turned out. This also applies to the 7th world as well. In this world there are 4 castle levels and a boss. The castle levels are called Outside 1, Outside 2, Lab 1 and Lab 2. The outside levels are probably Slippery Climb and Stormy Ascent, although as we all know, Stormy Ascent was eventually removed from the final version. At least from the map. It's still accessible in the original game via a password, I think, so if you want to, give it a go. Or just play the Insane Trilogy version. Lab 1 was most definitely the lab, and Lab 2 was probably just intended to be a second lab level, and the boss is obviously Neo Cortex. Cortex is the final boss, but what's interesting is that there is still an 8th world, most likely intended to be a bonus world. The reason I say that is because the world consists of 3 cavern levels called Bonus A, Bonus B and Bonus C. Now there aren't any actual cavern levels in the final game, but I do know that there is an unfinished cavern level called Acid Rain in the Crash 1 prototype, as well as a cavern filled with lava. These may have been intended as bonus levels after beating Cortex. There are a lot of videos online that show off these unfinished prototype levels, so definitely give them a watch if you're interested to see what they could have looked like. That's the end of this level list, and I think it's really cool to imagine what the game could have been like if it kept to this plan. This version appears to be a lot more organised and would probably have had a better and more logical sense of progression through the different environments. The next set of documents are from when Crash was still called Willy theWombat. It starts off talking about the opening cutscene, which sort of reads like your typical cartoon. Very fast paced and over the top. The script itself isn't much to talk about, but there are a few things of note here. Firstly, Willy theWombat talks. Not only that, he seems to rapidly change personality, going from noble to hyper to flirty, to even doing an impression of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Very different from the Crash we know. The main story is very much the same as the final version, just with a lot more dialogue and detail than what we ended up getting. Other things to note, Torna was originally called Carmen, and the opening cutscene would have also featured Cortex's other 6 mutant henchmen: Koala Khan, later renamed to Koala Kong, Ripperoo, Kimono and Komodo, who ended up being cut and later became the Komodo Bros in Crash 2, the Tasmanian Tiger, who also ended up being cut and later became Tiny Tiger in Crash 2, and Pinstripe. This set of documents also has another level list, but it's much further away from the one we just talked about. It features a lot of the level types that we ended up seeing in the level list and by extension the final version. It maintains the beach levels, jungle levels, rope bridge levels, ruins levels, power plant levels, castle levels and lab levels that we see in the final game, as well as the mountain levels, cavern levels and waterfall levels we see in the prototype and in that level list. But there are a bunch of level types here that don't appear in either. Firstly, there are 2 underwater levels. They both come right before a beach level, so I'm assuming that these levels are what bridges Crash to the next island. This concept of underwater levels would later return in Crash 3 as Under Pressure and Deep Trouble, so we can imagine what they may have looked like here. Just before the 3rd boss in this list, there is a level called Giant Tree, which is most likely a level based on the massive tree on the 2nd island in the final game. Before the 6th boss in this list, there is a level called Snow Mountains, and after it one called Sewer. These levels didn't even make the prototype version, but as we know, the idea for these levels did make it into Crash 2 through levels like Snow Go and the Eel Deal. There's also a dungeon level right before the 7th boss, which also didn't make the cut. There are also a few interesting things to note about the bosses in this version. The first boss is Papu Papu, but he doesn't yet have a name. He's just referred to as Head Native. Ripperoo and Koala Kong are the 2nd and 3rd bosses respectively, which matches up with the final game. The 4th boss is Komodo and Kimono, who, as we've established, would later become the Komodo Bros. Pinstripe is the 5th boss, followed by the 6th boss Tasmanian Tiger, who quite obviously would later become Tiny. The 7th boss is Embryo, but interestingly he's referred to as Needy Brio, which might be what the N originally stood for. And of course the final boss is Neo Cortex. These characters are described and drawn almost identically to how they turned out in the final game, or Crash 2, with the exception of some name changes. What's actually interesting is that this book includes the lyrics to the song used in that cartoon animation created for the game that was never used. The animation features all the characters that appeared in the final game, but it also features Tiny and the Komodo Bros as well, which shows that the animation was made around this point in development. Crash 1 is, as we know, a very bare-bones platformer. The only things Crash can do are move, jump, and spin. He collects Wumpa Fruit and can use Aku Aku for protection, and that's it. Originally though, there was going to be a lot more to it. For example, Crash was originally going to be able to pick up coconuts and throw them, perform belly slams, double jump, and perform a roll disarm. I think it's safe to assume that these ideas were tweaked and introduced later on in the series as the slide, belly slam, double jump, and fruit bazooka. Aku Aku was intended to appear in this older version, but he functioned very differently. Called the Witch Doctor, Aku Aku was always intended to be able to take damage and protect Crash, but he was also intended to be able to attack and deal damage to enemies that are further away than what Crash would reach with his spin. That's definitely a very different mechanic to how Aku Aku ended up, but it would have been cool to see how it would have worked in-game. Crash was originally going to be able to use temporary power-ups in the form of voodoo masks. There were going to be 6 types. The Scare Mask, which causes enemies to run away from Crash, the Magic Mask, which allows Crash to defeat any enemy simply by touching it, the Freeze Mask, which stops all enemies from moving, the Speed Mask, which allows Crash to move quickly and makes him invincible, the Silly Mask, which replaces Crash's spin attack with a more powerful attack, and the Laughing Mask, which draws in enemies towards Crash. It all sounds pretty cool, but I cannot imagine how it would have actually played out in-game. Then there's the fruit mechanic. We all know how the Wumpa Fruit mechanic works, but originally there weren't going to be any Wumpa Fruit. Instead there were going to be 5 different types of fruit. Coconuts, which were worth 1 fruit, mangoes, which were worth 2, strawberries 3, limes 4, and pineapples 5. Collecting 100 fruit grants an extra life. I think these different types of fruit can be seen somewhere in the prototype version. This would have been interesting to see, but I think I prefer just sticking to Wumpa Fruit in all honesty. But that's not all. There are more mechanics we need to talk about. In levels there would be skulls and flowers scattered around that would each have different effects. Let's start with the skulls. Small skulls are hidden in levels. If Crash touches them from the side they deal damage, but if Crash jumps on them they're destroyed. Destroying 3 of them grants invincibility. Large skulls serve the same purpose, but only 1 needs to be destroyed for invincibility. They deal damage when touched on the side, but jumping on them 3 times will destroy them. Talking skulls, when destroyed, will give Crash hints on where to find voodoo masks. It can only be destroyed by jumping on it 3 times without touching the ground. The magic skull also gives clues and works the same way as the talking skull, but it speaks in gibberish and can only be understood if you have the Witch Doctor with you. There are also 4 types of flower, and when collected they each have different effects. The spring flower will give Crash the ability to jump 50% higher than normal until he takes damage. The pepper flower will double the duration of Crash's spin attack. The special flower will increase Crash's speed by 50% until he takes damage, and the cactus flower will deal damage to Crash when collected. But wait, there's more! There are a handful more collectibles left to talk about. There's obviously the Crash face 1-ups, but there are also a few others that were supposed to have some cool effects. Firstly, there's the lightning bolt, which was supposed to defeat all enemies on screen when collected, which sounds pretty bonkers. Then there's the bubbling blue beaker, which allows Crash to tank twice as much damage as he would have been able to beforehand. This even has the potential to add a second Witch Doctor. Next is the bubbling red beaker, which shrinks Crash by 200%. And finally there are Yin Yang Yucks, which, if 100 are found throughout the game, will allow the player to access a minigame called Way of the Wombat, once the game is complete. There are no details on what this minigame was going to be, but it sounds pretty cool. There are also some details on secret areas being accessed by various switches, collectibles like artifacts and scrolls, and the function of stone blocks, which is probably where the crate idea originated from. But bloody hell, I gotta say, Willy the Wombat was going to be one hell of an ambitious game. I'm happy with the final game that we got, but I find myself wishing that the final product would have had more of what was planned. There are some things that I think would have been a bit unnecessary, like the skulls and flowers, different types of fruit and all that nonsense, but the extra level types, the Komodo Bros and Tiny, the power-ups, I think they would have been really cool to see. Luckily, we did get to see most of those things appear later on in the series, but yeah, Crash Bandicoot could have been something totally different to what we ended up getting. I'll be honest, after reading through this book and seeing what was going to be and what wasn't, Crash 1 does sort of seem a little disappointing, not gonna lie. What do you think about all this? Are you disappointed that we didn't end up getting some of that cool stuff, or are you glad that a lot of it was left behind? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about all this. I'm not really sure why, but I'm totally fascinated with all this development stuff, discovering things that were left out and imagining what games could have been like, so I hope you enjoyed this video, because I really enjoyed making it. If you did, I strongly encourage you to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye!